The arrival of U.S. House of Representatives Speaker and Democrat Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan last night caused a diplomatic ruckus. Historically, Taiwan's enormous neighbour, China, views it as a rogue state that should come under its control. Pelosi's gesture in visiting Taiwan as part of a Southeast Asia tour of 3 countries was also not backed by her President Joe Biden. She has since left Taiwan. Let's speak to international relations analyst Brooks Spector to dissect the story further. Brooks, always good to see you. So she came, she saw, did she conquer really?
Well, she had lunch. She met the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, who was a clearly democratically elected president of the island. In a way, too much is being made of this. Congressmen and women have periodically visited Taiwan. Nancy Pelosi has been there before when she was not yet the Speaker of the House. And a previous Speaker of the House, some quarter of a century ago or so, Newt Gingrich, also visited. But Nancy Pelosi and the Chinese in Beijing, the government, do not see eye to eye on a lot of things. She has been a strong critic of the Chinese government on human rights and civil rights issues, ranging from treatment of people in Hong Kong to the Uyghurs in northwest China, to the Tibetans, to religious freedom. And this, you can trace this back, in fact, to a visit she made in China, in Beijing, just a year or so after the Tiananmen Square student protests. She and another congressman brought in a banner which they held up, which expressed in no uncertain terms their sympathy for the student leaders who had been arrested or killed. And in part, this is a function of her district in San Francisco, which is significantly East Asian by descent, individuals by descent, but it's also a reflection of her strong human rights posture more generally. But you marry that with a forward version of international international outreach, international efforts, and you have pretty much the makings of Nancy Pelosi vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Taiwan. The Chinese, on the other hand, don't like this at all because it puts a finger in their eye in terms of their claim that Taiwan is an integral part of China and that some way, somehow, someday, it's going to see the light and rejoin the motherland, notwithstanding the fact that the communist government in Beijing never controlled Taiwan, because over the last 100 or so years, for 45 of those years, it was a Japanese colony, and then it became a refuge for the nationalist government that fled China mainland when the advent of communist rule began. And historically, you go further back, of course, than the Dutch and even the Portuguese had colonies there in the 16th and 17th centuries. So Taiwan has always had something of a separate idea of its circumstances internationally. China is much more powerful now than it was 25, 30 years ago, and it's able to demonstrate this towards Taiwan with military exercises, with air flights over the common sea, the Taiwan Strait, with missile launches, and all of which is designed to say, one way or another, you will come to appreciate the embrace that we'd like to have of you. And they also have managed to do things that shake the commercial version of Taiwan. They've banned the export of high-grade sand from China to Taiwan. You may think, sand? What's that? But sand is silicon, which is an integral part of microchips, and Taiwan is the world leader in the manufacture of the most high-tech microchips. So there are all manner of eddies and currents here. One takeaway, the final one, I guess, is that Nancy Pelosi's trip is not officially part of the U.S. government, the Biden administration's policies toward China. and it is reasonably clear from media reports that the Biden administration was not happy that Nancy Pelosi was taking this trip.
You say too much is being made about her visit to Taiwan. You've outlined her human rights record and speaking out against human rights violations. Yesterday in China, she said, "Today the world faces a choice between democracy and autocracy." What moral authority does the United Nations, yes, you've outlined that this is not in line with its policy towards China, but what moral authority do they have to dictate to other nations how they should run what they feel is best for their country?
Well, I think it's certainly her view to say that the government in Beijing is autocratic. I mean, it's certainly not directly elected by the people. That's a statement of fact. Whether or not she is saying that it's got to be replaced, that's a different thing. Whether or not she says that the government in Taiwan is democratic, again, it's a statement of fact. Is she telling the Chinese that they have to change their government style? I don't think we can extend it that far. What
possible consequences await her, if any, when she gets home?
Well, the consequences that await her in Washington, I think, are minimal. Among the members of Congress, Republican and Democratic alike, most of them probably share her view. This was one of the first times ever that Republican congressmen were quoted publicly saying, "Go get him, Nancy," and words to that effect. Because, if anything, many Republican congressmen share her views even more emphatically than her Democratic colleagues do. The real possibilities for consequences, I think, are on and around the island of Taiwan. Will the Chinese government step up its pressures militarily with the naval and the air exercises? Will they impose efforts to disrupt the possibility of shipping moving in and out of the Taiwan Strait, which is one of the world's busiest sea lanes, we should also note? Will the Chinese government put more pressure on Taiwan in terms of trade issues? We tend to forget sometimes that there is a very large volume of trade between Taiwan and China, and there is much investment in mainland China from Taiwanese entrepreneurs as well. So there are ample possibilities for ructions in that direction. There's also the possibility that it will make more complicated the ability of the Biden administration to keep encouraging the Chinese not to participate actively in sharing high technology weaponry and equipment with the Russians for their use in their ongoing invasion of Ukraine. So I think the consequences are real and the consequences are significant. But as far as Nancy Pelosi is concerned, I think the consequences are probably minimal.
Okay. Is this enough? I mean, well, this is what China sees as a provocation. We've heard those words in very recent history. When you take a look at what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, is war possible?
Well, I think the Chinese, they've made their case about as strongly as they can, absent actual troop movements or naval movements or air movements. The thing I worry about most, and I must be clear about this, is an accidental encounter between two naval vessels or between two fighter jets over international waters, one Chinese, one Taiwanese, or one Chinese and one American, perhaps, and two fighter pilots who are too enthusiastic. Maybe they've seen Top Gun Maverick once too often kind of thing. And accidental things like those kinds of encounters can have enormous consequences and repercussions. But I think, on balance, in Beijing, the Chinese government officials have made their point pretty clearly. And I think one other thing stands in their mind, and that is that they don't see the change in government in Taiwan to become yet another province of China as something that necessarily has to happen today, tomorrow, next week, or next year. I think they're taking a very long view on this, and we're going to see this set of circumstances continue with Taiwan as a separate democratic state, which is not part of China, but the Chinese insisting that it is or should be or will be, and with the United States backing Taiwan in its efforts to maintain its, I don't want to use the word independence, its circumstances, because the word independence is kind of a red flag to the Chinese as well.
Sure. Brooks, always a pleasure. Thank you very much. Keep warm. Brooks Spector is an international relations analyst.